Good afternoon. My name is Jennifer Cunningham. I'm the AVP for Alumni Relations here at Lehigh. And we have a really fantastic webinar for you today with Professor Dan Lopresti. I'm just going to give you a couple of housekeeping things and then we'll jump right in. We've got a half an hour. We want to make the most of every minute we have with him. So today what will happen is Dan will give a 5 to 10 minute overview of what he's working on, and then we will open it up to your questions. The most efficient way we found to do this is if you open up your chat box, which at the bottom of your screen, there's a thing that says chat, and it looks like a cartoon bubble with some dots in it. Just click on that and you'll see a window come up that says Zoom webinar chat. And at the very bottom of that, it says type message here. So just type your question there and then hit return. And I will be reading your questions to Dan so that he can concentrate on responses. So we'll have 20 to 25 minutes to do that. And then we will wrap up and you'll get a survey afterwards in case there was a question that you didn't get to ask. We'll make sure that, that Dan gets those. And you can also give us some feedback because we do these a couple times a month and we're always trying to get better. So with that, I will just jump right into it. Dan.
Oh, thanks, Jennifer. I want to thank you for giving me this opportunity. This is a project that I'm very passionate about. A lot of other people are passionate too. I don't want to ever give the impression that it's just me. There's actually a whole bunch of collaborators involved just in the things that we're doing, let alone on the international stage in this particular area. So the topic is artificial intelligence applied to the fight against human trafficking. And human trafficking is sometimes called modern slavery. It's a problem that afflicts tens of millions of people every day. It's an illicit industry that is enormous. There's billions of dollars flowing as a result of human trafficking activities. It's a very complex problem. It's not a simple technological problem. It's just as complex as the other really, really huge problems that face our society today. In fact, the United Nations has made it one of its Sustainable Development Goals. Its target 8.7 is the elimination of human trafficking and modern slavery. So that's what this comes from. And then I want to tell a little bit of the story about where we are today and some of the things that are going on. And I'm certainly very eager to answer questions from the viewers and the listeners. So the story actually starts with a Lehigh alumna, which is wonderful. Her name is Jennifer Long. And she is a former prosecutor, a former assistant district attorney. She's now the CEO of a nonprofit named Equitas. This is a DC-based nonprofit that provides support to prosecutors who are prosecuting crimes against women. And she approached me several years ago and said, you know, we're a small nonprofit. We don't have a lot of money. We've got a small staff. They work very, very hard. And we're just overwhelmed with the quantity of information that we've got to deal with nationally and internationally as we try to provide this support. You know, there are basically thousands and tens of thousands of documents that have to be read and understood and categorized and analyzed. Are there techniques from artificial intelligence that could be applied to help this? So that's how this conversation started. Jennifer, it turns out, has got an amazing set of connections, an amazing Rolodex, and getting to know her has been certainly one of the high points of my involvement in this work. So one of the connections she made for us was here in the Lehigh Valley, over in Lehigh County, in Allentown. There is a facility called the Regional Intelligence and Investigation Center, or RIC, and it's the director is Julia Coaches. And this is a really interesting facility in Lehigh Valley that brings in data streams, all kinds of data streams that will be useful to law enforcement. And the basic idea is that if you just look at one piece of data, one piece of information, you might not be connecting the dots that allows you to identify certain kinds of crimes that are taking place. It turns out human trafficking is one of these kinds of crimes where if you just have a single view, a single snapshot, you're going to miss it. You're going to call it something else. You're going to identify it, for example, as a prostitution or as a drug crime, not realizing that there's a web of interconnections of victims and the perpetrators working together. So it's much bigger than a single incident. So we got connected with Julia at the RIC in Allentown, and another colleague of Jennifer's, Colleen Owens, who's very interested in the issue of labor trafficking, especially labor trafficking in the fashion industry. And we got together with some of my colleagues in the CSE department and start talking about how we would apply AI techniques to the problem areas. So our work is aimed, our first set of goals are aimed at helping the RIC deal with, again, their information overload problem. So they've got coded data that they use to answer some of their questions when they're doing investigations. But a lot of the wealth of the information that's present there is written in what are called narratives. So every time a law enforcement officer investigates anything, he or she will write a report. They'll type some data into a database, but then they'll write a report in English. And Julia and her colleagues at the RIC felt that buried within these textual reports, there were the keys that would link together the perpetrators and the victims and the places these things were happening. The problem is it's very tedious to read through all of these reports and start making these connections manually. So the question is, can we develop AI and text mining, text analysis, and graph mining techniques? So that's the problem that we're trying to approach right now. Just to give an idea of the magnitude, they've got over 4 million of these narrative reports. That's just in Lehigh County. So you can imagine reading through millions of narrative reports, trying to connect the dots together to identify incidents of human trafficking. So this is an area where certainly artificial intelligence can provide a big, big, big benefit. And that's what we're working on with them at this point. We just started working on it. So that's one line that we're working on here at Lehigh. Another very interesting developed more on the international stage. Again, as a result of a connection that Jennifer had, we got connected to the United Nations. Now, I mentioned the UN has Target 8.7, which is one of the Sustainable Development Goals to eliminate human trafficking and modern slavery. We got connected with some individuals in the UN University office, and they said, oh, we were just at an international workshop at the Alan Turing Institute in London, which is the UK's National Data Science and AI Institute. They were running a workshop on exactly this problem, how to apply computational science and AI in the fight against human trafficking. So as a result of those connections, we pulled together the threads, and we now have an international collaboration that we call Code 8.7. It involves UN University, it involves the Alan Turing Institute, which again is the UK's National Data Science and AI Institute. It involves some universities in the UK. It involves Arizona State University as well. I have a colleague there. It involves some survivor organizations as well, survivors, advocates, policymakers too. And we organized a conference at the United Nations in February, a first conference. And if you look online, you'll be able to find the sessions, the videos for the conference, the topics, and the final report. My involvement there was actually to bring in colleagues in the national computing research community. So I serve on the CCC Council, which is a national organization that brings together computer science researchers around the country on problems of interest, really big, hard problems of interest. And I felt that this idea of applying AI in human trafficking was exactly one of those kinds of problems. So my colleagues on CCC were very, very interested and very eager to get involved, and a number of them are participating in the project too. And I'm very happy to say that CCC, along with UN University and the Alan Turing Institute and our other partners, will be organizing a follow-on workshop in Washington, DC in the spring, exactly at this question: what are the computing research issues that would help, in very significant ways, address this problem of ending human trafficking and modern slavery. So Jennifer, that's sort of an overview. I can obviously
go on for
I could go on for days, or I could dig deeper, but I'll let you ask some questions.
Okay, great. Audience, now it's time for you to type your questions in. Again, at the bottom of your screen, it says chat. Just type your message there and hit send or hit return, and I will read the questions to Dan. While you're thinking about your questions, you mentioned the Lehigh Valley, and you said there's 4 million records just here alone. Why is the Lehigh Valley such a hotbed for trafficking?
Well, so those are 4 million law enforcement's just records, narratives for all the incidents that might take place, whether they're crimes or just investigations that law enforcement does. And our hypothesis is that buried within that massive pile of information, there will be instances of trafficking that have not yet been discovered. There certainly are cases right now that are being worked on. There are some successful prosecutions, although it's been relatively recent that it's been possible to even pull together all of the dots
Mm.
and then apply the laws that are also changing right now as we
Right.
speak to be successful there. So within those narratives, we suspect there are connections and there are threads. And I want to really point out that even though we expect that the computers and the machine learning and the AI will help pull out from this massive pile of data evidence of this kind of a crime, the computers are not really making the final decision. It really is just passing that on to a human expert, to the law enforcement, saying, we think it's worth looking here. We're shining a light for them in a dark corner and saying, you might look over here, you might find what you're looking for over here.
Okay. Ray Schubnell has a question. Great cause and background. Can you give some tangible examples of AI application?
Yeah, certainly. So machine learning is a big area right now, and computer vision is too. So an example would be analyzing these records, these narratives that I mentioned. So to be able to analyze 4 million narratives and do it effectively, we'll need natural language understanding because these are in English for people to read, not for machines to read. So we need machines that can read police narratives as well as human experts can. There'll be issues in resolving, sometimes people use aliases. It's not like they're identifiable by the name that they give you necessarily. Being able to correlate locations, places, times, incidents. So that's kind of like what's called graph mining, making those connections between people and places and colleagues and perpetrators and victims. So this is almost like a social network graph, but it's a social network graph for criminal activity as opposed to for legitimate purposes. So we need graph mining techniques and machine learning applied to that. There's some really interesting work being done at the University of Nottingham in the area of computer vision, making use of ubiquitous satellite imagery. So we now, we live in a surveillance era, and there are satellites over us all the time that are imaging places around the world that people can't walk or travel. And they're developing techniques to analyze satellite imagery to find evidence of human activity that might potentially be illicit activity, including human trafficking or labor trafficking, labor issues.
So George Klasik's question touched on this a little bit, but is it an organized crime issue or many small groups of criminals, or is this the AI will actually help you answer that question?
I think it runs the gamut from relatively small organizations to very major organizations, involving very large numbers of individuals and very large amounts of money. Human trafficking is second only to drug trafficking in terms of, I've got like a message on my, sorry. Yeah, there was an automatic software update that was about to reboot my computer. Yeah, this is technology for you, so you can't make this stuff up, right? So yeah, the size of the activity could be relatively small or it could be very large. I want to emphasize that it's not purely international. It could be purely within one country. It could be purely within one state. A lot of people think it involves only women, but it involves men as well. Men can be trafficked too. It doesn't just involve adults, it involves children as well. It's not just for sexual purposes, it's for any kind of exploitation. It also certainly can be for labor too. So any of those things are potentially indicators of trafficking. And it could, as I said, could be relatively small or it could be a fairly substantially sized organization.
Don Davenport asked, is there a procedure to test the effectiveness of the AI application?
Well, certainly none of this stuff sort of lives on its own in isolation. So, the ultimate judge of whether it's effective or not is when you give it to the end users, which could be law enforcement. I didn't say too much about helping survivors directly or helping organizations that help survivors, but AI can also certainly help there as well. You can provide apps to survivors to help them find the resources they need, or even apps that might be available to people who are currently victims of trafficking to help them try to get out of that life. And then also to the advocates and the organizations on the ground that are trying to help them too. So really the ultimate measure of success is whether they're telling you that it's working, that it's helping, and taking that feedback. I want to make it very clear that when we did the UN conference in February, and also for the event that we're planning in Washington next spring, survivors are always an important part of the discussion. So it's not scientists going off on their own thinking that they're solving the problem. It really is taking constant feedback and input from survivors and advocates, policymakers, and law enforcement.
William Gill's question how will the information be translated to users, the data or the narrative? Is there training need? If so, how does that come to be? And then I was thinking about that. The information you're getting in and of itself, would that be defensible in a court of law, or it's again what the people do with the information you're getting?
It's very much what people do with the information that you're getting. And there's been a lot of discussion about artificial intelligence and machine learning and what's called explainable AI. So right now we have machine learning that can do a very good job at identifying something, but it can't tell you why. It can say, this looks interesting, but I can't really tell you why it looks interesting, right? So we always need humans looking at it and saying, okay, I see what's going on here. I understand it. So that'll be important. There's certainly job security, though. Our jobs will change a bit, hopefully in very good ways. But I would argue there is job security if you're willing to sort of go with the trend. Education will be very, very important. Some of these users are going to be pretty sophisticated. So, you know, in the Rick and Allentown, they're already sophisticated users of information systems and graphical displays. So we'll just layer on top of that, and we have a very sophisticated professional user base. If we're talking about applications that might help survivors or victims, or be used by small organizations, advocates on the ground, obviously that's a different kind of user interface. And again, you know, the goal of a lot of long-range AI research is to create interfaces that are much more natural for humans to use. So right now, you know, I had to cope with this screen and like a message that came up, and I moused and I clicked it. But you know, the verbal communication, you know, oral communication and visual communication are very important. Computers are just starting to get a little bit good at that. But you can imagine that over the next 5 or 10 years, those kinds of interactions will become much more natural. And instead of having to type on my computer and saying, I'm in trouble now, what can I do about it? You'll actually have a conversation with the more advanced AI that is part of the research agenda that we've got over the next 10 or 20 years.
And then can you also imagine that the criminals will figure out how to game the AI system and use the aliases in a different way, or hack their location-based GPS, you know?
Well, so it's always a cat and mouse game. So anything that's in the area of security, you know, how you talk about cybersecurity, computer security, or physical personal security, it always is a cat and mouse game. I mean, it should come as no surprise that the criminals were using the advanced apps and social networking the same way legitimate users are using it. No surprise. They figured out how to do it. They figured out how to use the financial system, anonymity, encryption, right? So it is very much a race, and law enforcement is always trying to stay ahead. One step, That's exactly right.
So Maureen O'Meara works with the Lehigh Valley-based Safe Home for Survivors, and she's hoping to stay connected to you, your efforts through newsletters or social media.
Sure, absolutely. So if I would encourage anyone who has an interest in this to get in touch with me, and certainly in the Lehigh Valley. I've already been connected to some of the great organizations here, and you know, it's very impressive about the amount of dedication and amount of effort that's being aimed at this problem at all levels. I will say, technology and AI is not going to solve the problem by itself. No way. It's just one of the tools that we will hopefully be able to use.
Well, and that's a great segue to another question about the class you teach is called AI for Social Good. Can you tell us more about that? Like, what kinds of problems are they trying to solve? What jobs might they get after they leave?
Right. Well, so, you know, big tech has gotten a lot of bad press lately, and some of it deservedly so. Companies want to make money, of course, but they also should be very careful about the social footprint that they leave, you know, the effect they have on society. So as a result, both in academia and also in some of the companies, there's been this realization that we need to talk about AI for social good. You know, the good things that AI can do in addition to making money for shareholders and for companies. So the goal of the class was to take our students who are very good technically and basically say, okay, let's think about these problems a little bit differently now. It's not just coming up with a cool app that's going to make you a lot of money. That's great if you can do it. But also let's talk about your impact on people and talk about the kinds of things you might do when you go out in the real world that would have a positive impact on a city or the citizens, or, you know, some group that would help them in a way that, you know, a company might not directly do immediately because maybe there isn't really that much profit involved in that, right? So we had it was a project-oriented course, and we had some students who worked on some kind of really interesting projects. In one semester, you can't get that far, but there was one student who was very interested in working on social media in a city and the way people talk about the city services they get, the transportation services, the bus is late, there's a pothole on this road, whether it'd be possible to develop techniques, AI techniques that would process that and then help the city realize what's going on more quickly than you might otherwise be able to learn about it based on social media, what they're saying on social media. There were a couple groups that looked at trying to identify the quality of the housing stock in the city of Allentown. So I was working with some colleagues in Allentown, and they basically said, it'd be really great if we didn't have to send people out and look at everything and figure out the quality of the housing stock. But there's already a lot of imagery. There's Google Street View, for example. You can basically get Street View imagery. Is there a way to use that and judge the quality of the housing stock so that we can reduce the labor requirements and take that labor and apply it in more productive ways rather than forcing people to drive up and down the street and with a clipboard, right? So there's students who worked on that project. I had one project that was inspired by Jennifer Long in Equitas, and that was to be able to read narratives, to read descriptions of maybe criminal incidents or things that have happened to people, and then take that information using natural language understanding and then populate a form so that it's possible for the experts, the lawyers, the attorneys who work with Equitas, to judge the complexity of prosecutions for sexual crimes. And the feeling there is prosecutors are sometimes judged on their success rates, the number of cases they win, and they're allowed to choose which cases they prosecute. So there might be a natural tendency to choose the easier cases and not choose the harder cases. And is there a way to try to quantify the hardness or the difficulty of the case? So the students, developed some AI techniques to be able to read these narratives and then start to imagine populating a form with that information that is gleaned, like what a human expert could do.
There's a professor we did a webinar with in the supply chain area, and I think this is the first time I really heard about why the Lehigh Valley is a hotbed for this because of the supply chain. Zachariah, do you work with him or his students?
I don't, but you're right. That this idea that unfortunately it's a business like other businesses, and you can talk about a supply chain with human trafficking or labor trafficking or drug trafficking, frankly, or counterfeit pharmaceuticals. It's a supply chain, right? So the Lehigh Valley is got a tremendous benefit of being well positioned geographically and well located on the East Coast. This is one of the reasons why we have so many warehouses, including some of the very large distribution companies that choose us because we're so close to so many people on the East Coast. But it also makes us a very attractive place for some of these criminal activities and some of these criminal trafficking activities. And you're right, it's about the supply chain.
Yeah. Julia Coxon is curious about the conference that you're having in the spring. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Right. So the conference in the spring is a computing research conference, but it's going to bring together also some policymakers, lawmakers, and survivors too. It will be very much focused on having the computing research community sit down and say, okay, we know what our goals are for AI research for the next 10 years, the next 20 years, but we want to now figure out how this connects to a very important problem for society. So how can we make these connections between these relatively long-range abstract goals for artificial intelligence and make it a connection to this very important problem of how do we apply this as one of the steps in eliminating human trafficking.
Is it something that people can sign up for, or it's just invite only?
It's a relatively small conference. The products of the conference will become available, will be broadly available. So we certainly will publish reports, and there'll be follow-on activities as well. The actual in-person activity will be fairly small. Typically, it's only 40 or 50 people. So when we did the UN conference, we were able to stream it, and that's recorded and available on the UN University website. I'm not sure that we'll do that in the spring, but I would imagine there'll be follow-on things that we might go back and do at the UN that would be available via streaming. So,
are you going to do another UN conference?
It's certainly a possibility. Right now, I'm focused on getting the one in DC in good shape. But of course, we're collaborating with this big group, and I'm sure our colleagues are also planning their own activities as well.
So in a year, 5 years, where do you hope this will be?
Mhm. Well, certainly, what I would like to see is within a year or two, you're talking about things that are too near term for research. So these are more taking existing techniques and adapting them and specializing them to be useful to law enforcement, to be useful to advocates, to survivors, and to victims. So there's already activity happening in that realm. There are some tech companies that are helping right now, but we certainly are looking for more support for that too. There is, I don't want to suggest that everything is long range research. At a university, we tend to think in terms of 10 years out, right? We want to be able to do this. There are things that can be done today by taking existing state-of-the-art AI and computational techniques and applying them to the problem. So I would like very much to see that. And, again, I'm a researcher, so I can strongly encourage that and maybe try to make the connections that would allow that to happen. So within 1 or 2 or 3, 4 years, that's what I'd like to see happen. And then I would also like to see within that same time frame, members of my community, my computing research community across the country, who are some of the most brilliant people you would meet, identify this as one of their target applications and basically say, I'm developing advanced machine learning, user interface, user interaction, computer vision techniques. My goals are 10 years out, but I'm doing this with the Code 8.7 goals in mind, the goals of applying AI to eliminate human trafficking.
Right. Are there other industries or social good efforts where this has already been proven to be very successful?
So where AI is starting to be applied? Oh yeah, if you go online and search for AI for social good, I think you'll find some really wonderful examples of communities. Sometimes they're local, sometimes they're national, that have come together for the purposes of, again, making the world a better place, helping society be, do better across the board, and not just with the profit motive in mind, but more towards making the world a better place.
Right. And so you came to the human trafficking piece through Jennifer Long. Were there other things that you were thinking about before you met her that maybe you would have gone a different way had she not appeared in your...
I probably wouldn't be doing this. There's certainly a lot of other things I do that we haven't talked about today, but I probably would not be doing this exact set of things. So it really is a tremendous amount of serendipity, and also Jennifer's enthusiasm too, and her Rolodex as well, and all the great people she knows.
Amazing.
Absolutely.
Great.
Yeah, so I very much want to encourage anyone who's interested in digging deeper. You can find a lot of resources on the web. I'm the first to admit that I'm not an expert in this, but I love working with great people and colleagues. Solving big problems like this is a real collaboration. You can't come at it from just one direction. You need to come at it from a number of different directions. And that's one of the things that really makes me excited. It's not the pure technical issues, as it is working with others who are deeply committed to the same problems, but approaching it from the direction they need to approach it from. If you want to get involved in some way, please feel free to contact me. I'm happy to answer further questions, either via email or via other means. I've mentioned some other individuals who are great resources too. I don't want to splash their contact information online, but I'd be very happy to set up those connections as well when they make sense.
All right, thank you, everybody. It is 1 o'clock. Again, we'll be sending you a survey to collect any other questions, and we will get Dan's contact information for you if you so would like that. All right, thanks, and have a great rest of your Thursday. Thank you.